Jacob Carson was known in town as the lazy boy. He didn't care about school, chores, or much of anything. He preferred lying on his bed, scrolling through his phone, or playing video games. His parents were always nagging him to be more responsible, but he ignored them. His grades were a mess, and his room looked like a tornado had hit it. But Jacob didn't mind. He was content with doing nothing. It was a Friday evening in late October, and Jacob was enjoying his usual routine of lounging in bed. The autumn wind howled outside, rattling the windows of his small suburban home. The streets were quiet, with most families getting ready for the Halloween weekend. But not Jacob. He was planning to stay in, binge-watch movies, and avoid any responsibilities. As he stared at the glowing screen of his phone, he noticed something odd out of the corner of his eye. The window next to his bed, a window that overlooked the backyard, had a shadow. Someone was standing outside, peering in. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He sat up quickly, but when he looked directly at the window, the shadow was gone. He chuckled to himself, shaking his head. Probably just a tree branch or something, he muttered. But his pulse hadn't slowed down. He tried to get back into his game, but the feeling that someone had been watching him lingered. His eyes darted back to the window every few seconds. The wind picked up, causing the trees to sway wildly, their branches scraping against the house like long fingers. The once comforting quiet of his room now felt suffocating. A few minutes passed, and he forced himself to calm down. "It's nothing," he repeated in his head. But then, something happened that made his skin crawl. There was a knock. A soft, deliberate knock on the window. Jacob froze, his fingers hovering above his phone. Slowly, he turned his head. The window was closed, curtains partially drawn, but there was no mistaking it. A dark figure stood just outside, its face obscured by the night. Panic surged through him. He scrambled out of bed and bolted for the door, but before he could open it, his phone buzzed. A message. With trembling hands, he glanced at the screen. "Why are you running, Jacob?" His blood turned to ice. The message came from an unknown number, and the timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Whoever was outside knew his name. He hesitated, heart pounding in his chest, and glanced back at the window. The figure was gone. Jacob's breath came in short, panicked gasps. He was sure he had seen someone know something outside his window. And now this message. His mind raced. Who could it be? A prank? Maybe one of his friends trying to scare him for Halloween? The rational part of his brain urged him to calm down. But every hair on his body stood on end. He couldn't shake the sensation that someone or something was still watching him. His phone buzzed again. "You can't ignore me, Jacob. You're too lazy to escape, remember?" His fingers tightened around the phone. How did they know? Who was this? He bolted from his room and down the stairs. His parents were out for the night, and his older brother was at college. He was alone in the house. He needed to do something, call the police, run outside, find help, but his feet felt glued to the floor as a deep sense of dread weighed him down. He glanced back at the front door, debating whether to leave the house. But what if whoever was outside was waiting for him? Jacob peered through the peephole, but saw only the empty street. No movement, no shadowy figure. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. "I see you looking out the front door. You think that's going to save you?" Jacob's stomach twisted. Whoever this was had eyes on him, right now, watching his every move. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the situation. Was there a camera in his house? Were they somehow controlling the phone? His gaze shot to the living room window. He thought he saw a flicker of movement outside. He had to think fast. Instead of running, he retreated into the kitchen and pulled a knife from the drawer, gripping it tightly in his shaking hand. His phone buzzed yet again. "Getting a knife, Jacob? How predictable. You can't even handle your schoolwork. How are you going to handle me?" The air in the room seemed to thicken. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to steady his breathing, but his fear had a hold on him. This person knew too much about him, about his laziness, about his habits. They had been watching him for a while. This wasn't a random prank. This was personal. He had to confront this somehow. Gathering every ounce of courage he had, Jacob typed back a response. "Who are you?" Seconds ticked by, the only sound in the room his own ragged breathing. Finally, his phone buzzed. "You'll find out soon enough. Look outside." Jacob's heart leapt into his throat. He hesitated, not wanting to obey, but curiosity and fear pushed him forward. Slowly, he edged toward the window and peeled back the curtain just enough to peek out. At first, he saw nothing. The backyard was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of a distant street lamp. But then he spotted it. A figure, standing motionless at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the light. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its face obscured by a hood. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as the figure raised its hand, pointing directly at him. His phone buzzed again. "You're too late, Jacob. I'm already inside." Jacob's blood ran cold. He whipped around, his eyes darting frantically across the dark kitchen, searching for any sign of movement. The house was silent, too silent. The ticking of the kitchen clock, once comforting in its rhythmic pace, now felt like a countdown. His grip tightened on the knife, though the cold steel felt feeble against the growing dread. "I'm already inside." The words echoed in his mind, each syllable sending a jolt of terror through him. He hadn't heard any doors open, hadn't heard windows break, but something in the air was different. He could feel it. He wasn't alone. His phone buzzed again, but this time he ignored it. He couldn't take his eyes off the dark hallway that led to the rest of the house. It stretched like a yawning mouth, leading to shadows that seemed to move and breathe. Was the figure really in there? Or was it still outside playing tricks on him? A sudden creak echoed from upstairs. Jacob's heart pounded louder in his chest. He knew that sound. It was the floorboard in front of his bedroom. Someone or something was moving up there. Panic clawed at his mind. His body screamed for him to run, but his legs felt paralyzed. He couldn't leave, couldn't make himself bolt for the door. What if the intruder was faster? What if they were waiting for him to make that exact move? With a trembling hand, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911, pressing the call button as quickly as he could. No signal. Of course, he muttered through gritted teeth, cursing his spotty reception. Sweat trickled down the back of his neck as he forced himself to think. He couldn't stay here, but he also couldn't face whatever was waiting upstairs. Another creak, this time louder, closer. The thing was coming down the stairs. Jacob's pulse quickened. His mind raced. He had to hide, somewhere safe, somewhere this intruder wouldn't think to look. His eyes darted around the kitchen. The pantry? No, it was too obvious. The back door? He'd have to run through the yard. Too risky. His gaze fell on the basement door, slightly ajar. The basement. It was dark and cluttered with his parents. Without wasting another second, Jacob crept toward the basement door, his movements slow and deliberate. His breath hitched in his throat as the stairs above groaned again, signaling the intruder's descent. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't hear him. With painstaking care, he slipped through the basement door and pulled it closed behind him, not daring to make a sound. The darkness enveloped him as he descended the stairs, one careful step at a time. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, but he prayed they were too quiet to alert whoever, or whatever, was in the house. At the bottom of the stairs, the air was thick with the scent of dust and damp wood. He crouched low, slipping behind a large stack of old boxes and furniture. His heart thundered in his chest, his breath shallow as he strained to listen. The house above was quiet again. Too quiet. For a few tense minutes, Jacob stayed hidden, gripping the knife so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was terrified to even look at his phone for fear the light would give him away. But then, faint footsteps reached his ears. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the floor above him. The intruder was searching the house. Jacob's breath hitched. What if they knew he was hiding in the basement? He could hear the footsteps pause at the top of the stairs, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, the basement door creaked open. Jacob's heart raced, every fiber of his being screaming for him to stay perfectly still. He heard the slow, deliberate sound of someone descending the stairs, each step reverberating through the darkness like a countdown to his doom. He held his breath, clutching the knife to his chest, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps were growing closer, echoing in the narrow space, louder and louder. He could barely see through the gaps between the boxes, but he sensed the presence, tall, dark, and ominous, moving through the basement. The intruder was down here, searching. Jacob's mind raced. He couldn't fight them. Not in the dark, not like this. But he couldn't run either. He was trapped. His only hope was that they wouldn't find him. But then, the footsteps stopped, right in front of his hiding spot. Jacob's entire body tensed. He dared not breathe, dared not blink. The figure stood there, just a few feet away, unmoving. The air felt thick with tension, as if the walls themselves were closing in around him. The silence stretched on, suffocating him. What were they waiting for? Were they toying with him? Did they know he was there? Just as Jacob thought he might pass out from sheer terror, the figure moved again. Slowly, deliberately, they turned and walked back up the stairs. Each step was agonizingly slow, as if they wanted him to know they could have found him if they wanted to. The basement door creaked shut. Jacob exhaled shakily, feeling the tension ease ever so slightly. But his relief was short-lived. His phone buzzed in his pocket, louder in the oppressive silence. He fumbled for it, praying it hadn't given him away. A new message glowed on the screen. "Nice hiding spot, Jacob. You almost fooled me." Jacob's heart felt like it was going to explode. His entire body was frozen in place as he stared at the glowing message on his phone. "Nice hiding spot, Jacob. You almost fooled me." His fingers trembled, the knife feeling heavier in his hand. He had to get out. He had to find a way to escape this nightmare. But how? Whoever this was, they knew every move he made. They were playing a sick game, one he didn't know how to win. Forcing himself to breathe, Jacob weighed his options. The figure had gone back upstairs, but he couldn't risk running into them if he tried to escape now. The basement, dark and cluttered, felt both like a prison and a shield. Maybe he could use that to his advantage. He crouched lower, scanning the room. His eyes landed on an old tool chest near the far wall. His father's tools. If there was something he could use to defend himself, maybe he'd stand a chance. Slowly, he crept toward the chest, keeping his movements silent. His pulse hammered in his ears, every creak of the floor making him wince. He reached the tool chest and gingerly opened the lid. Inside, he found a rusty hammer, a few wrenches, and a screwdriver. The knife still felt like his best option for now, but the hammer gave him a shred of hope. He picked it up, weighing it in his hand. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Just then, he heard the faintest sound, a creak above him. His head snapped up, heart pounding once more. The intruder was moving again, but not upstairs. No, the sound was coming from the basement door. They were coming back. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He had to think fast. He couldn't just sit there and wait to be found. He glanced around, desperate for a place to hide or an exit. His eyes fell on the small window near the ceiling, just big enough for him to crawl through. But getting to it would mean moving out into the open. Could he make it in time? Footsteps echoed on the stairs. The intruder was descending, slower this time, as if savoring the hunt. Jacob felt the weight of the hammer in his hand, his heart racing. He made a split-second decision. In a burst of adrenaline, he bolted from his hiding spot, making a dash for the window. His sneakers skidded across the concrete floor as he leapt up, grabbing the ledge and hoisting himself toward the glass. He pushed against the window with all his strength, praying it would open. It didn't budge. Panic flooded his veins as he shoved harder, trying to force it open, but the old wood frame was stuck, swollen with years of dampness. The footsteps were getting closer now. He could hear the intruder's slow, deliberate breathing behind him. Jacob's hands fumbled, yanking harder at the window, but his movements were clumsy with fear. He risked a glance behind him. The figure stood at the bottom of the stairs, tall and looming in the darkness. The hood still obscured their face, but Jacob could feel their gaze, piercing and cold, locked onto him. With a final, desperate shove, the window gave way, and Jacob squeezed himself through the tight opening, scraping his arms on the rough edges as he scrambled outside. The cold night air hit him like a slap in the face, but he didn't stop. He dropped onto the damp grass and immediately sprinted across the backyard, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, he heard the window creak open. The intruder was following him. Jacob ran faster than he had ever run before, feet pounding against the earth as he dashed toward the line of trees at the back of the yard. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away, far away. He darted into the woods, branches whipping against his face and tearing at his clothes. The thick canopy of trees blocked out most of the moonlight, leaving him in near total darkness. His chest burned from the cold air, but he didn't dare slow down. Somewhere behind him, he could hear the faint sound of footsteps. The figure was still chasing him, moving silently but steadily through the underbrush. Jacob could feel them closing in. Panic clawed at him. He needed to think of something fast. Running blindly through the woods wasn't going to save him. He needed to hide or find help, but out here in the darkness, there was nowhere to go. He stumbled over a root, nearly falling, but caught himself just in time. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and despite everything, he couldn't resist the urge to look. Another message, from the same unknown number. "You're making this fun, Jacob. But it's almost over." Jacob's stomach churned. He was running out of options, and the intruder was playing with him, like a predator toying with its prey. He needed help, but who could he turn to? His phone had no signal, and his parents wouldn't be home for hours. His mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, each one more hopeless than the last. Then, up ahead, through the trees, he saw something, a faint light. A cabin? A house? He couldn't be sure, but it was his only shot. Without thinking, Jacob changed direction, sprinting toward the light. His legs burned, and his lungs felt like they were about to collapse, but he pushed through the pain. The footsteps behind him grew fainter as he put distance between himself and the figure. The light grew brighter, and soon, he broke through the tree-line into a small clearing. In the middle of it stood an old, run-down cabin, the front porch light flickering weakly in the night. It looked abandoned, but Jacob didn't care. He had no other choice. He raced to the front door, praying it wasn't locked. His hand shook as he grabbed the handle and twisted. The door swung open. Jacob rushed inside, slamming the door behind him and locking it with trembling hands. The inside of the cabin was dark and musty, but it felt like a fortress compared to the open woods. He pressed his back against the door, trying to catch his breath, listening for any sign of the intruder. Silence. For a moment, Jacob allowed himself to believe he was safe. Maybe he had lost them. Maybe this nightmare was finally over. But then, a new sound filled the cabin. A slow, deliberate creak, coming from the darkness. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. Something was inside the cabin. Jacob's heart pounded in his ears as he stood frozen against the door of the old cabin, the musty air thick with an unsettling quiet. His lungs burned from the sprint, but he barely noticed. The creak had come from inside, from somewhere deep within the shadows of the room. His eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the dim shapes and hulking furniture that filled the space. The single flickering light on the porch barely penetrated the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. He strained his ears, desperate to hear another sound, to know where the intruder might be. Another creak echoed, this time closer. The floorboards groaned under the weight of something, or someone, moving through the cabin. Jacob's grip tightened on the hammer. His hand was slick with sweat, his knuckles white. He had nowhere to run now. His only option was to face whatever was coming. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, Jacob took a slow, cautious step forward. His footfalls were almost soundless, but the thick tension in the room made every tiny movement feel like a thunderclap. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and uneven, as he edged toward the middle of the cabin. Another creak. This time, it was unmistakable. Someone was moving through the hallway leading to the back of the cabin. Jacob swallowed hard. He could feel the presence before he saw it, a chilling awareness that prickled along his spine. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It wasn't the hooded stranger from outside. It was someone else. A woman, dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes, her face gaunt and pale. Her eyes, sunken and empty, locked onto Jacob's as she stepped into the faint light. She moved with an eerie, unnatural grace, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Jacob's heart lurched. He took a step back, instinctively raising the hammer in front of him. The woman's lips parted into a slow, twisted smile, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too perfect. She tilted her head, her eyes glinting with something dark, something hungry. Who are you? Jacob's voice was barely more than a whisper, his throat tight with fear. He felt like he was in some twisted dream, unable to wake up. The woman didn't answer. She took another step toward him, her movements slow, deliberate. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and Jacob's skin prickled with a deep, unnatural chill. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. Suddenly, the front door rattled behind him. Someone or something was trying to get in. Jacob's mind raced. The hooded figure from outside had followed him, and now they were both trapped in the same space. His fingers twitched around the hammer, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the fear tightening like a vice around his chest. The door shook again, harder this time. Whoever was on the other side wasn't going to wait much longer. The woman's smile widened as if she knew what was coming. She took one final step toward Jacob, her eyes glittering with malice. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice soft but dripping with menace. Jacob's legs felt like lead. He had to move, had to do something, but his body refused to cooperate. The hammer in his hand felt useless, too small against the overwhelming terror that gripped him. The door behind him burst open with a loud crash. Jacob spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The hooded figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the flickering porch light. Their face was still hidden, but the menace that radiated from them was palpable. Slowly, they stepped inside, closing the door behind them with a deliberate, ominous thud. Jacob was trapped, cornered between the hooded figure and the ghostly woman. His mind screamed for an escape, but there was none. He was out of time. The hooded figure raised their head, and for the first time, Jacob caught a glimpse of their face, or what was left of it. Pale, hollow eyes stared out from a gaunt, skeletal face, a face that looked like it had been dead for years. The sight sent a jolt of pure terror through him. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, and with shaking hands, he pulled it out, dreading what he would see. "No more hiding, Jacob." The message was from the same unknown number, but now he knew. They were both here, the hooded figure and the woman. They weren't human. They weren't real. But somehow, they had been watching him all along. Jacob backed up against the wall, gripping the hammer so tightly that his hand ached. He had no plan, no idea how to fight back, but he wasn't going to just give up. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. The woman took another step toward him, her eerie smile never wavering. "You're not the first, you know," she whispered, her voice sending chills down Jacob's spine. "We've seen so many like you running, hiding, thinking they can escape." The hooded figure moved closer too, their hollow eyes locked on Jacob. Jacob's back pressed hard against the cold wood of the wall. His breath came in ragged gasps, and the room seemed to spin around him. He was cornered, with nowhere to go. But then, a thought hit him. Something small, but something that might just be enough. He glanced toward the fireplace on the far side of the room. There, resting in the hearth, was a pile of dry wood, and beside it, a box of matches. Fire. It was his only chance. Without hesitating, Jacob lunged toward the fireplace, knocking over furniture as he scrambled to grab the matches. The woman let out a shrill, inhuman shriek as he struck the first match and tossed it into the dry wood. Flames roared to life almost immediately, casting the room in a bright, flickering light. The shadows danced wildly, and the hooded figure recoiled, their form flickering like a bad signal on a TV. Jacob didn't stop. He grabbed another log and shoved it into the fire, feeding the flames, making them bigger, brighter. The woman's smile twisted into a snarl, and she backed away, her once confident demeanor crumbling as the fire grew. The hooded figure stumbled, their skeletal face distorting in the firelight. Jacob's heart raced, but for the first time, He felt a flicker of hope.
Fire.
It was working. He had found their weakness. But as the flames grew, so did the danger. The old cabin was dry and brittle, and the fire was spreading fast. Smoke began to fill the room, and Jacob knew he had only minutes before the whole place went up in flames. The woman screamed, her form flickering in and out of existence as the fire consumed the room. "You think this will save you?" she hissed, her voice twisted with rage. "We'll find you again. We always do." But Jacob wasn't listening. He was already making his way toward the broken front door, choking on the thick smoke as he ran into the night. Jacob stumbled out of the burning cabin, coughing and gasping for air. The night felt cold and damp against his skin, but the relief was short-lived. The flames roared behind him, spreading quickly through the dry wood, sending sparks into the sky. The fire illuminated the surrounding trees, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch toward him like grasping hands. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't slow down. Behind him, through the crackle of flames and the creaking of the collapsing cabin, he could still hear them. The woman's voice, shrill and twisted, and the hooded figure's slow, deliberate footsteps. The fire hadn't stopped them. It had only slowed them down. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burning wood, but Jacob pushed through, his legs aching from exhaustion. He glanced back just once, seeing the cabin engulfed in flames, but the shadowy figures still lingered on the edge of the firelight. The woman's distorted figure flickered, her once human form now more monstrous, her glowing eyes locked on him. She was coming for him. They both were. Jacob turned and sprinted into the forest, his feet pounding against the earth. The branches and underbrush tore at his clothes and skin, but he didn't care. His heart raced, every muscle in his body screaming in protest, but he couldn't stop.
Not yet.
Not until he was far, far away. The forest around him felt like a maze, the trees towering above, their limbs reaching out like they wanted to trap him. His mind raced, searching for any sign of direction, but the woods were unfamiliar. Every path looked the same, every shadow hiding the possibility of danger. But what choice did he have? He had to keep moving. Behind him, the shriek of the woman echoed through the trees, unnaturally loud, making the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. "You can't run forever, Jacob," her voice called, twisted and mocking. "We will find you." Jacob's pulse quickened. He didn't dare look back again. He knew they were closer. They were always closer. The cold air stung his lungs, and the darkness seemed to press in on him. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent waves of panic through his already frayed nerves. His legs felt like lead, heavy and sluggish, but he pushed through the pain, his mind focused only on survival. Then, up ahead, through the thick tangle of trees, he saw something, a faint light cutting through the shadows. His heart leaped with hope. Was it a house? A car? Some kind of help? He pushed himself harder, forcing his tired legs to move faster, closing the distance between him and the light. As he got closer, he saw that it wasn't a house. It was a road, a small, winding country road, barely illuminated by an old street lamp. The light flickered weakly, casting a sickly yellow glow across the pavement. But the road meant hope. It meant he could flag someone down, find a way to escape. Jacob burst out of the tree line, his feet hitting the cracked asphalt as he stumbled forward, waving his arms wildly. "Help! Somebody help!" he shouted, his voice hoarse from smoke and fear. The road was empty. He looked both ways, his heart sinking. There were no cars, no signs of life. Just the quiet hum of the wind and the faint rustling of leaves. Despair started to creep in, but he couldn't give up. He couldn't stop here. Jacob glanced back toward the forest. The flickering light from the cabin fire was distant now, but the darkness of the woods was alive with movement. He could feel their presence getting closer, stalking him from the shadows. The woman, the hooded figure, they weren't far behind. With no other options, Jacob turned and ran down the road, his sneakers slapping against the pavement, the cold night air biting at his skin. The street lamp's glow faded behind him, leaving him in almost total darkness, but he kept running, kept hoping he would find something, anything, that could save him. The road curved ahead, disappearing into more shadows, but as Jacob rounded the bend, he saw it. A car, parked on the side of the road. The headlights were off, but the silhouette of the vehicle was unmistakable. He couldn't see anyone inside, but he didn't care. This was his chance. He sprinted toward the car, his heart pounding in his ears, desperation driving him forward. As he reached the driver's side, he slammed his fist against the window. "Hey, please, I need help. Let me in." No response. Jacob yanked on the door handle, praying it was unlocked. It clicked open, and without thinking, he dove inside, slamming the door shut behind him. He fumbled with the keys in the ignition. They were still there. Trembling, he turned them, and the engine roared to life. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. The moment the headlights came on, he saw them. Standing in the middle of the road, not 20 feet in front of the car, were the hooded figure and the woman. Their eyes glowed eerily in the headlights, their forms dark and twisted. The woman's face had stretched into something grotesque, her mouth wide with an unnerving, predatory grin. The hooded figure stood motionless, their skeletal face now fully visible, eyes hollow and dead. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, the weight of the moment crushing him. They were waiting for him. They knew he had nowhere left to run. For a brief second, Jacob hesitated. Could he drive through them? Could he even escape this? The woman stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. Jacob's mind screamed at him to move, to do something, anything, but fear paralyzed him. His pulse thundered in his ears, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. Then, the hooded figure raised one hand, pointing directly at him. That was enough to snap Jacob out of his daze. His foot slammed on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as the engine roared. He hurtled toward the figures, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He didn't care what happened next. He just needed to escape. As the car closed the distance, the figures didn't move. They stood their ground, eyes locked on Jacob, as if daring him to hit them. The moment before impact, they vanished,